And on to Pierre and Halligan today, we're debating the issue of women's safety following a spate of cases where women have had their drinks spiked at nightclubs, and there are also disturbing reports of women being spiked with needles in clubs. So we're asking, why can't women have a safe night out?
And it's not just our guests we want to hear from. Join the debate with your view. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at GBNews.
That's our main talking point today, women's safety amidst this growing number of cases where women have had their drinks spiked at house parties and nightclubs across the country, particularly students. There are also reports of women being jabbed with needles in clubs.
Nottingham police are questioning a man in relation to a report that a 19-year-old woman was spiked by injection at a nightclub. The Nottingham University student is said to have felt a pinch on the back of her arm before blacking out.
Many women took to social media to report their experience of this. Here's one from a first-year university student who we're keeping anonymous, but whose identity we've verified.
The injections thing is the most recent thing they're now doing, and people are more scared than ever. But the scariest thing to me is how unsurprised we all are. We go out in groups, we refuse drinks, we keep our phones on and in our hands. Girls are wearing denim jackets because the material is harder to pierce. We simply accept the latest horror and come up with new ways to protect ourselves.
So that's the really alarming, shocking view from one student on social media. And joining us now is Niamh Robinson, who's a student at Nottingham University, as well as the editor-in-chief of the university's magazine, The Impact. Niamh, thank you so much for coming on GB News. We're most grateful to you. Are you surprised that we've had reports of young women being spiked in nightclubs, both via their drinks and now with needles? Or is this something that you're hearing about a lot?
Firstly, thank you for having me on the show today. And unfortunately, I have to say, I'm really not surprised at all. This is something which has cropped up again and again, I think largely under the radar. And Impact magazine, who I work with at the university, have actually been investigating women's safety for a number of months now, because it's something that we realised was a real issue. And now that obviously things have escalated and these spikings are making national news, it just seems to be the next concerning development in an ongoing story, really.
Do you know any women who have been affected by this? If you do, would you tell us their story?
So personally, I can't say I know someone firsthand, but I've had a lot of young women, or those identifying as women, coming to me and telling me about friends and friends of friends who have had such experiences. One such story was a young woman who went out to a nightclub and she found herself suddenly, very, very unwell. Her friends realized that she was paralytic, and it was very unlikely that this was the result of her own alcohol consumption, as she was very measured with her drinks. And they felt that the response on the part of paramedics perhaps didn't live up to what they had hoped. And it seemed to be, largely on talking about just sort of playing down the situation rather than really dealing with the issue at hand, which was, the fact that women are at risk and we're absolutely terrified. I think the general feeling is that, young women are very scared to go out right now because we just don't know what more we can do to protect ourselves.
We should say, Niamh, that the identity of the young woman whose testimony we read out before, she's not at Nottingham University. You are at Nottingham University. To what extent do you think universities are responsible? If you and your mates, you go out into the city where your university happens to be based, you're at a nightclub that's nothing to do with the university, while the university can provide, routine pastoral care and so on, isn't it down to the nightclub owners, their security, rather than the university authorities to protect you when you're in a nightclub?
In all honesty, I think it should be a collaborative effort. Whilst we're at university, we're under the care of the university institution, and I completely understand that nightclubs in town are outside of their remit. but the university is actually working closely with Nottinghamshire Police. They have taken it as a very serious concern and as their responsibility. And I believe that that's rightly so. This is not an issue that's going to be solved by one institution alone, by just the nightclub owners, adding more bouncers on the door or upping their search measures. This is a systemic, genuine issue which needs to start at the grassroots level with educating individuals within universities and then hoping that those attitude changes lead to less women and those identifying as women being at risk in the clubs on nights out.
Sarah Crew, who is the National Police Chiefs Council lead for rape and adult sexual offences, has told MPs today that plainclothes police officers are likely to be deployed in nightclubs to combat this new form of spiking. That's welcome, surely.
I think there are mixed feelings at the university about this, in all honesty. Obviously, in the wake of the Sarah Everard case, I think a lot of young women do feel that the police aren't always their friend. And that's a really upsetting thought, because obviously the natural reaction should be, yes, we would feel far more protected.
We've lost her there.
What a shame there. We've lost Neve Robinson, a student at Nottingham University. She's editor-in-chief of Impact Student Magazine. I'm sorry we've lost your sound and vision, Neve, but you spoke extremely well and we're most grateful for your contribution. Joining us on the show now is author and former independent advisor to the government, Emily Hunt, and political editor at The Mirror, Pippa Crerar. Thank you both for joining us. Pippa, your paper has been reporting on a case today, Tell us about that.
So this was the case of Zara Owens, who was, like many of your viewers and our readers, was a young woman student who had gone to a nightclub. And like young women across the board in these situations, unfortunately, take great care that her drink wasn't spiked. Not accepting drinks from strangers, covering drinks, all the sort of things, unfortunately, that we're all too used to doing. But then was injected with the drug instead, and suddenly came over all woozy, and fortunately was in a position where her friends were able to scoop her up outside and take her home. But then when she woke up the next day, noticed that there was sort of a sore mark on her leg, and she'd actually been injected with some drug, but then struggled to be able to sort of report that to police and the authorities. Obviously, with the added concerns beyond the sort of the initial spiking were then whether the needle was clean and whether she could be in a vulnerable position as a result of that. So clearly was concerned about needing some medical attention. A really horrific story. And on the back of, obviously we've all been talking about this over the last 24 hours, and on the back of this, I opened up my Twitter DMs and to readers and suggested that if people wanted to share their stories, they could get in touch. And I'm afraid to say there's been huge numbers of people coming forward, lots, as you might expect, with stories of themselves or their friends having their drinks spiked. It's a long time since I was at university or, going out clubs regularly, but this is something that's been going on for a very, very long time. And it's just really, frankly, depressing that the situation there hasn't got any better. But more worryingly, there was also examples of this new phenomenon where people had been injected with some drug or other. And it's this sort of new phenomenon which is, I think, really making young women much more fearful. You kind of are used to all the old threats. That's not to say that they should exist or that we shouldn't challenge them, but this seems so difficult for somebody to protect themselves against. It's obviously shouldn't be on women to protect themselves. It should be on the perpetrators not to do it. But obviously it's extremely alarming for lots of these people. And I have to say I'm quite shocked by the number of people that got in touch with their own stories about this.
Emily Hunt, we just heard from Neve Robinson, a young student journalist at Nottingham University. She said her university and the police are taking a collaborative approach to this, to reports and instances of students being jabbed with syringes in nightclubs. What would you be asking the government to do as a former government advisor? How should ministers be responding to an issue which really has caused alarm, as Pippa Crerar says, in the last 24 hours?
So I should probably clarify, I am still an independent advisor to the government on sexual violence. So can't really speak to what I would say to ministers. But as a victim of what I believe was a drug facilitated sexual attack, I can completely understand where people are coming from. So I believed that I was drugged, and unfortunately, the police didn't take that seriously, and toxicology wasn't done fast enough. Because most of these drugs metabolize out of the system in 6 to 12 hours. So quite literally 83% of the time, the drugs are gone in 6 to 12 hours. So particularly with a smaller woman with fast metabolism, you're on a very fast timeline to prove that anything has happened. Because I wanted to know if what happened to me happened to lots of people, I actually had a survey done. My background was in political research, so it seemed sensible at the time. And unfortunately, what I found is that 51% of women 18 to 24 either have been drugged or know someone who's been drugged for the purpose of sexual assault. And that is just drink spiking as opposed to this new trend towards actual essentially stabbing somebody with a syringe, which I read about this morning as well, and was just deeply horrified of.
Pippa, just thinking about what demands we can practically make. I mean, what is this drug? How do people get hold of it? Can they be stopped from getting hold of it? Is that a practical way forward, perhaps, Pippa?
Well, I think the Home Office are obviously going to have to look at this in more detail. Priti Patel has already suggested this morning that she's consulting with police about the scale of the problem, which anecdotally seems worryingly widespread. But of course, they will have a better. Well, you'd hope they'd have a better view of how effective it is. Although, as others rightly point out, the police, first of all, women don't always go to the police with these. About these incidents, and secondly, if they do, they're not always taken seriously, unfortunately. But it probably has to go broader than that. It can't just be about Priti Patel saying to the police, "Come on, guys, you need to do it better on this." It probably needs to be some sort of like convening of venue owners, sort of industry bodies, of universities, not exclusively of all these young women at university, but lots of them seem to be. And certainly lots of the replies that I was getting last night seemed to be from students who felt that their own universities weren't doing enough to make not only women aware, but men aware of the risk, but also of the potential, the trouble they could get into, what they faced in terms of I think I've lost you. I'm not sure if I have.
No, carry on.
Yeah, you're still there. Sorry, my screen went blank there for a minute. But in terms of the charges they might face if they ended up being perpetrators in these incidents. So the venues, the universities, women's groups, and the police probably all need to sit down together and try and work out exactly the answers to the sort of questions you're mentioning there, Gloria. What is this? What are these materials? How are these drugs? How are people getting hold of them? Is it something that's easily accessible to anybody going into a chemist or can produce themselves, or is it something that's actually on the black market and therefore outlawed? I think the honest answer to that question is we probably don't know, but one would imagine that they're not impossible to get hold of. But if what routes are they coming in? Are they getting them from the internet? And if so, is that something you can crack down on with the support of big firms online? So there's not much. It's a new phenomenon, it seems like, and terrifying one. And because we don't know enough about it, I think really the onus has to be initially on fact finding and bringing together all those individuals. So hopefully that's what we'll see in the coming days from the government.
Emily, I'm no lawyer. Pippa just mentioned charges there. It strikes me that we're going to, as and when people guilty of injecting young women in nightclubs are arrested and charged, it strikes me there needs to be some really stiff sentences. It seems to me beyond assault, it seems to me to be grievous bodily harm if you are injecting somebody against their will without even their knowledge with a substance which could potentially harm them. This is not banter. This is not jolly japes. Yeah. Surely there needs to be custodial sentences, even if the people involved, the men involved, and you can only assume it's going to be almost entirely men who are doing this, even if they're relatively young and relatively inexperienced.
So I think it's really important that we reflect on literally the first thing I thought this morning when I read this story, which is we need to be prosecuting rapists, right? That's where we start. We are not really imagining that people are drugging women, whether through syringe or drink, just to do it. We're all pretty much expecting that it's for the purpose of drug-assisted sexual assault. Unfortunately, we still have a 1.6% charge rate for rape. So right now, we have men out there who have no deterrent, essentially, on committing rape. And in previous studies, we've seen that over 30% of university-aged men would have sex with somebody against their will, as long as they knew there would never be a consequence. And I absolutely feel like the story this morning is showing what happens when we do not prosecute rape and there is no deterrent. Because you're right, right now, the people who are out there doing this think that there will be no consequence. And unfortunately, right now, we're showing them that they're right. And what we need to do as a society is have some really big conversations with the people around us that starts with, actually, is it really okay to get the double shot in the gin and tonic when a girl asks for one shot? That's where we start. It's okay to try to get somebody a bit drunk to loosen them up. That's how Friday night banter goes. Well, then the next step on that path is putting a drug in somebody's drink. And then the next step on that path is what we're seeing now. We need to stop this path at the beginning and be having conversations with the people around us about what consent is, because people are going down this path slowly. You're not waking up one morning and deciding to stick a syringe in someone. You're starting somewhere else. And we absolutely need to be prosecuting rape in order to keep people from thinking that there will be no consequence.
Pippa, we're, I don't know, roughly the same age. And you think as a woman that as times advance, then things advance for women. But when I'm sure you had nights out when in your, late teens, 20s, we all did. At no point, I'd worry about getting home safely, making sure there was a minicab or a taxi. But at no point did I worry about what was going to happen to me when I was in that club or pub, whether or not somebody was going to drug me. How has our culture got worse?
Well, I think there was some evidence of drink spiking when I was around at uni, but it certainly wasn't as widespread as it seems to be now. I mean, the statistics there about, half of people knowing somebody that had been drugged are really astonishing. I mean, it was a rarity when I was in my late teens and early 20s, albeit an awful one. I think this is a really big question, isn't it? And so much of it comes down to education and exposure. And I don't just mean education in the classroom, I mean education from your peers, and particularly if you're a boy, but also how they interact with their female peers, and also at home with your families. And it's boys and men ultimately that need to step up on this, but also exposure. And the second, but by that I mean what people see online, what becomes acceptable, the sort of depersonalization of women, whether it's through pornography or whether it's through sort of anonymity on social media accounts, and the abuse that it's easier to throw at somebody that's just a name on a Twitter account than you would ever consider in person. And it's slippery slope you mentioned, isn't it? It's the path. It's like, it's okay, they'll start by being rude about someone they don't know on Facebook or Twitter, and then it's sort of, it gradually escalates. That's not to say, of course, that every sort of abusive comment online ends up in a sort of a real life incident. But if you don't call it out early, I very strongly believe that those individuals that might go down that route feel that they can do so without, they can do so without any sort of challenge. And that comes back to the debate that's also being had in this place in the Commons at the moment about misogyny and whether it should become a hate crime. And I know that lots of people think, well, why, God, you spoil sports. Why should you stop a builder having fun shouting, all right, love, how's it, cheer up, love, or like nice skirt, nice legs, whatever, as you're walking down the street? Fine. But think about how it makes that individual feel. And actually, if that sort of personal commentary is tolerated, then what comes next? Does it mean that they feel okay, that it's okay to touch somebody when they're in a nightclub, to grind up against them when they're dancing? I mean, I'm not saying that you can stop people. You should necessarily stop people complimenting or learning through discussion with friends and colleagues what's acceptable and what's not. But I do think that clearly our young men need some more guidance, and that has to be done through sort of sensitive educating and thinking about what they're exposed to online.
Pippa Crerar, political editor of The Mirror, and Emily Hunt, author and independent advisor to the government. Thanks for your contribution to a very, very important discussion, and a discussion that certainly Gloria and I and all of us here at GB News are determined will continue in the weeks and months ahead.